Hello, I'm Father Damien Ryan. I'm the parish priest of Our Lady of the Holy Souls in Kensal Newtown. Welcome to this video, which is going to be about addressing criticisms of Alpha. So we have done one public season of Alpha, and we're going to be starting a second season very soon. I've been enjoying speaking with people about, inviting them to Alpha, but I've noticed that one or two or a few people have even said that they've actually done some research on Alpha and they've been Googling Alpha in the Catholic Church, and they have concerns and they've been hearing criticisms. So I want to just lay out what some of the criticisms are, and then talk about them from a Catholic perspective, what I understand about how Alpha is not only can it be used in the Catholic Church, but I believe that Alpha is so important to complementing what Catholic churches already do and see themselves, and actually helps us to live out our calling to be and make missionary disciples as Christians, as followers of Jesus, as Catholics. So one of the criticisms is it's not Catholic. Another is it's overly focused on the Bible. It's fundamentalist, especially about kind of moral issues, example, sexual sins. It can be accommodationist, too trendy. Some people say, well, it's overly emotional. Some people say there's an overemphasis on God's love, not his holiness. Some said that it's a cult. Some said that it's got too much emphasis on the Holy Spirit, that it's charismatic. And some people say that it's got too much emphasis on healing. So these 9 issues I'm going to just speak about now. The first thing is, the argument is it's not Catholic. And some people say, well, it doesn't cover everything that is Catholic. For example, Marian dogmas, the Eucharist. So speaking about those particular issues, if we're taking that as normative, we shouldn't pray the creed at Mass. We should stop praying the creed at every Catholic Mass, because the creed doesn't mention any Marian dogmas. It doesn't actually mention the Eucharist. It doesn't mention that baptism is necessary for salvation. So should we dispense with the creed? No, because it's supposed to be a basic overarching summary. And so is Alpha. Alpha means beginning in Greek. It's the Alpha course, not the Alpha and Omega course, the beginning and end. So Catholics, what we tend to do is define ourselves by what is exclusively Catholic. So what we exclusively believe, this is a kind of a counter-reformational mentality, that we just say that we define ourselves, not the things that we also share in belief with non-Catholic Christians, just stuff that is just Catholic. So, and Catholics also tend to emphasize teaching, which is like inexhaustible. There are so many ways of explaining things, but we are not so much practice at kerygma and evangelization, which can be both simpler in proclamation and in getting people to give their life assent. So that's about not being Catholic, about the topics that it doesn't cover. And some people say, well, even some of the topics that are talked about, even the content is not Catholic. So there's, for example, in one of the videos, there's a substitutionary theory of redemption about the cross. It talks about the nature of the church is not really Catholic. There's no mention of apostolic succession, like bishops and popes. It doesn't mention that baptism, it kind of doesn't state that baptism is necessary for salvation. Someone said that the topic of evil puts the devil on a par with God. Now, I noticed, to give some credence to these arguments, I noticed that some topics were not the deepest and fullest explanation of the truths of Catholicism. So, for example, this one still bugs me a little bit. The substitutionary theory of the cross, is that Jesus substituted himself in our place. And it's not only the most basic explanation of the cross, it can leave an achingly open the difficult question, well, why does God need anyone to die in the first place? And that never gets answered. So even I can feel like, oh, that could be a little bit better, surely. However, when I think about it, Alpha is not really for me. It's for those who are outside, who are not churchgoers. So it's a bit like, I remember I was in secondary school and I called a rectangle an oblong, and everyone laughed at me. And I said, well, why are you laughing? And they said, well, children call rectangles oblongs. We don't when you reach kind of 10. And I think substitutionary theory is like the lowest entry point for have zero understanding. It's basically a way of just saying oblong for a rectangle. So that's what I would say for that one. And it's similar when it comes to the nature of the church. It doesn't talk about the very nature of the church that Jesus founded, the Catholic Church. But there's a reason why it doesn't do that. And the reason is Alpha is supposed to be a tool for every single church and denomination. There's only one church, and that's the Catholic Church, and other churches are denominations. But Evangelii Gaudium, so Pope Francis's encyclical 246 paragraph, says that tools of evangelization, I'm only paraphrasing here, tools of evangelization can be shared among churches are preferable for the sake of unity. So it's better to have something that we can all share, because it's only when we are united, every single follower of Jesus, that we can hope to actually show the world that, unity can be possible. Now, there's no mention of apostolic succession or the bishops or the Pope. But the reason is, if people do Alpha in a Catholic church or here, the next step will be an introduction into the life of the church that has a Pope, that has bishops. And any teaching will be explained along the kind of the decades that people have to live. They don't always have to do it in 24 hours. We've got, 24 years or many years before we die. It doesn't specifically say that baptism is necessary salvation, but it emphasizes faith. Now, indeed, the Catechism of the Catholic Church says that baptism is necessary for salvation. But it goes on to say, but God is not bound by the sacraments. So in other words, baptism is not necessary for God to save us, but baptism is necessary for us to know that we have been, we are being, and we will be saved. It's necessary for us, not for God. And someone said that the topic of evil puts the devil on a par with God. And to be honest, I'm not sure how they came to that conclusion. Alpha clearly states that in Jesus, God has won the battle over the devil, sin and death. It says that we're in the kind of a mopping up period after that battle, a bit like the D-Day in the Second World War, that, Allied powers have effectively won, but there needed to be just the completion of that. I suppose it's a bit like being 10-0 up in a football game with 1 minute to go. And, you try not to concede a goal, but if you do, then it's kind of like, well, it's not the end of the world. So we still have work to do. We don't want to concede any goals. And it says, Alpha says that we can overcome evil with good. A criticism is, and I've read this, I've never heard anyone say it, but it can be fundamentalist about moral issues, for example, sexual sins. Actually, I do remember a priest said that they weren't comfortable with the topic of sex being brought up at all. And it does mention it, but doesn't have a whole video on it. And the only reason why Alpha just mentions it in one of the videos is because society at this time has a radically different understanding of sex as something like a leisure pursuit. And Alpha describes sex as an act of love. And I personally think that if anyone thinks that it's fundamentalist about sexual issues or moral issues, it might be because, they might have their own personal issues about those things. Some people say, well, Alpha is overly focused on the Bible. And it's true that in the Catholic Church that there are three sources of authority: the Bible, the magisterium, and the sacred tradition, what has proved to be effective in passing on faith. And I think the reason why Alpha, one of the reasons why Catholics can use Alpha with a good conscience, is because the Bible can be a great first step for non-churchgoers to have access to God's authoritative word in a way that's that they can actually is more accessible to them. So the magisterium in Catholic tradition can be perceived by non-churchgoers as overly influenced by human factors, as human decisions. And the Bible can be seen as just an easy entry point of authority. And as Catholics, I know that when you take a Bible, it's actually the Catholic Church that says what goes in there. So it's just an easy way for people, and again, just to pray with the Bible and to hear God speak to them. Some people argue that the Alpha is accommodationist, that it tries to be too trendy. And I think, well, Alpha does all it can to accommodate non-churchgoers. And the only caveat when people do Alpha is that people have to allow others to share freely. And, Jesus said in John's Gospel, John chapter 1, it says Jesus pitched his tabernacle, his tent among us. And, he died for his enemies. So Jesus accommodated humanity without losing his essence. And the same reason, Alpha, it accommodates so much just so people can talk about Jesus and maybe come to accept him and to want to be his disciple. Some people say that Alpha is overly emotional, and Alpha permits people to give, to express emotions, to share their feelings, both in conversations and maybe during prayer and during song. And Alpha simply explains that God can speak through our emotions, and we can speak to God through our emotions. But not always. God doesn't always speak to us through our emotions. He's super emotional, so he's in our emotions, but he's not of our emotions. He operates above them, and he doesn't always work through our emotions. But he can use them, and we can use them. Some people say that there's an overemphasis on God's love, not God's holiness. Holiness does not mean primarily righteous, so being kind of like, holy by our own selves. It means, actually, a technical word, it means to be set apart. So in one sense, God's love is primary because God's love is what sets him apart. So knowing God's love and being firm in God's love enables us to actually be holy. You can't be holy without God's love. One person in the parish said that, is it a cult? I thought, well, I admire her honesty here. A cult, in the Cambridge Dictionary, a cult is, quote, a religious group often living together whose beliefs are considered extreme or strange by many people. And it also says it could be a cult of personality. Well, the style of Alpha is that there's no follow-up, it's free, and the discussion is necessarily open. So we don't want people who are just going to say what the church teaches all the time, like a parrot. It's like we're condemned to say anything you want. And so in one sense, it's an opposite of a cult because it's very free in every way. And Alpha is done all around the world. There's no cult of personality because it's done all around the world with different Christian leaders endorsing it. So, and even Catholic leaders like Raniero Cantalamessa, he was the preacher to the 3 papal households. Cardinal Schonborn, who basically wrote the Catechism. Cardinal Tagle, who's a fantastic cardinal of the Philippines. So it's not a cult of personality. Some people say, well, there's too much emphasis on the Holy Spirit. It's too charismatic. And the priest who trained in Rome took me aside several years ago on a retreat, and he knew that I ran Alpha, and he said, Alpha isn't Catholic. You said you need to be careful because it's charismatic. It talks about the Holy Spirit. And I think what he was saying was that he thought the only authentic expression of the Holy Spirit is sacramental. So it's when a priest does something, or when it's an ordination of a priest, or confirmation chrism, or the sacrament of the sick. But the Second Vatican Council document, Lumen Gentium, says that the Holy Spirit marks the Church, and I'm quoting here, with hierarchic, that is priestly gifts, and charismatic gifts. So gifts that is proper to baptize and priests. It's not just for priests. And St. Paul says that we should pray for gifts of the Holy Spirit. He said that we should go on being filled with the Holy Spirit. He talks about speaking in tongues, and that he himself speaks in tongues, and he wants everyone to speak in tongues. And no one accuses St. Paul of being a charismatic. And apparently a study in the 1970s showed that the first 8 centuries of Christianity, it was very normal practice to pray to be filled with the Holy Spirit. It was only in the 20th century that it became a little bit more into the hands of priests, and now the Pentecostal and charismatic movements are now sharing what has already actually been lost by the Catholic Church. And then finally, some people are critical of the emphasis on healing. And I'll say that Jesus healed in about 33% of the time in the Gospels. A lot of his ministry was a ministry of healing. And he told his disciples to heal the sick and raise the dead. And they did. And St. Peter's shadow healed someone. And Jesus said that we would do greater things than him. So many Catholic priests and lay people have an authentic charism of healing. And I suppose what Alpha does, it just gives permission for people to either pray to be healed, to receive healing, and to try to pray for others to be healed. So that's addressing the criticism of Alpha, that it's not Catholic, it's overly focused on the Bible, fundamentalist, accommodationist, or too trendy, over-emotional, overemphasis on God's love, not holiness. It's a cult, emphasis on the Holy Spirit, charismatic, emphasis on healing. I hope that this has come to allay any of your fears. I want you, everyone in this parish, to try Alpha, because I think in its right context, in a Catholic context, it can really help fill out what it really means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Thank you, and see you at Alpha.